AP Stats Saturday, scenario number 2. This is question 2004, or 2004 test question 1. Again, this is another box plot problem. And then we have a consumer advocate conducted a test of 2 popular gasoline additives, A and B. There are claims that the use of either of these additives will increase gasoline mileage in cars. A random sample of 30 cars were selected. Each car was filled with gasoline and the cars were run under the same driving conditions until the gas tanks were empty. The distance traveled was recorded for the car. Additive A was randomly assigned to 15 of the cars and additive B was randomly assigned to the other 15. The gas tank of each car was filled with gasoline and the additive. The cars were again run under the same driving conditions until the tanks were empty. The distance traveled was recorded, and the difference in distance with additive minus the distance without additive for each car was calculated. So what we have here is we have additive A, how far it traveled, minus how far it traveled not with additive A. And we have additive B, how far it traveled, minus how far it traveled without it. So that gave us the two sets of data. And we have a list of minimum values, Q1, the median, Q3, maximum values, etc. And then it says, on the grid below, display parallel box plots showing outliers, if any, of the differences of the 2 additives. All right, so this was to the best of my ability. Trying to do this in Microsoft Word. I probably could have done a little better if I'd actually done it by hand, but I'm not sure you would have been able to read it. Please make sure that you label things. Notice I labeled additive A and additive B, and I also labeled the scale. Distance, how is it calculated, with, minus, without. All right? So I want to draw box plots, and yes, they gave me some minimum values, but what I don't know is this minimum or any minimum outlier? Is this maximum or any maximum outlier? So the very first thing I need to do is calculate my outliers. I must show my work, all right? And so when we're working with box plots, we know that we're gonna have to calculate our IQR, so we show that, which is what I've done here. And the ones in blue were for additive A, and I just color-coded it so it'd make it easier for those of you, as y'all see it. And calculation is IQR Q3 minus Q1, which was 4 minus 1 from the table, giving me 3. And then X, which is my fence, is less than the first quartile minus 1.5 IQRs. So if I have any outlier, any value below negative 3.5, I have an outlier. Well, I drew my fence, and sure enough, I have 2 values that are below the 3.5. Negative 2 was also a low value, but it's not an outlier, and so it's actually connected. All right, it's actually connected. The median's here at 3, Q1, Q3. And by the way, one of the things that if you don't like writing the numeric scale, one of the things you can do is actually come back and just sit there and go median, Q3, Q1, and put those labels in. But that was a little bit difficult for me to do. And since I had the scale at the bottom, I didn't have to worry about it. So I need to do the outliers for both of them. Okay, so here we go. We have both outliers done, and I'm not going to go through the computations for both of them, but make sure you show your work for both of them. And I struggle to get that all on the screen, so I'm going to slide this up fairly slowly so you have an opportunity to catch that down. Copy that down. So continuing on, 2 ways that the effectiveness of gasoline additives can be evaluated are looking by either at the proportion of cars that have increased gas mileage, all right, the proportion of cars who have increased gas mileage when the additive is used, or the mean increase in gas mileage. Okay, so right here, they're asking what percent, the largest percent, or here they're looking for the average increase. All right. So Which additive, A or B, would be recommended if the goal is to increase gas mileage in the highest percent of cars? They want to increase it in the highest percent of cars. Well, what percent increased? Well, here, all right, anything below 0 didn't have an increase. So this is where the breakover. Anything to the right was an increase, anything to the left was not an increase. Well, when I look at additive A, that's 1, 2, 3 quartiles, or 75% of my data is above. So in this case, 75% of the cars had an increase. So 75% had an increase, whereas when I look at additive B, so I know greater than 75, I know that at least 25% of the cars had a decrease. So what would I choose? I would choose additive A over B because at least 75% of the cars traveled a greater distance with additive A, while more than 25% of the cars experienced a decrease in distance traveled with additive B. Pretty specific, covered increase and decrease. Now, the next part of that question, part 2, kind of addresses what someone asked about shape, all right? Because here we have a box plot. I can look at this shape and go, you know what, this has been stretched out. And part B said, or part 2 says, which additive, A or B, would you recommend if the goal is to have the highest mean or highest average increase in gas mileage? Explain your choice. Well, because this is skewed, I know that my mean is to the right of my median. Because this is skewed, I know the mean is to the right of the median. This one, if anything, because of the outliers, my mean has probably been pulled down, all right? And because this is so highly skewed, I expect my mean to have gone up fairly much, so I'm going to choose additive B, because my mean I expect to have been pulled up above my median. So I would choose additive B. I answered the question. No context, no points. Then I go on. Additive A's outliers on the low side lower the mean below the median of 3. In contrast, additive B is skewed heavily to the right or highly to the right with a mean that is much greater than the median of 1 and greater than the mean of additive A. All right, so that would be my justification. I'm going to pause this.
Like if you look at quiz 1, question 2 PDF, that is the official scoring guideline for this question. So let's talk about what we noticed and what they were looking for. What I noticed on the quizzes that you guys turned in was most of you guys did really well doing your graph, the box plots. The only issue that I saw sometimes is that students would not leave the outliers as separate dots. I had some students connect the whisker to the outliers on additive A, and that should not be like that. I noticed that some students put extra dots in their whiskers, and that's not necessary, but that's not like super horrible. But your outliers have to be distinct, separate dots. That's what makes them outliers in your graph. And then the only other thing was that I noticed that some people were missing labels. In the college board rubric, they only allow for one label to be missing, and that is on the the bottom axis. If that was the only label that was missing, you could still be essentially correct, but you had to have additive A and additive B labeled. Otherwise, you would be knocked down automatically to a partial. So it's super important that you are labeling correctly. For the next part, for B, when we start talking about which one is better for the greatest number of cars, you can't simply just say additive A. You have to justify it, and when you justify it, what we're looking for, what the College Board was looking for, was a direct statement, like Mr. Spencer was talking about. Like, look at your axis here at 0, right? You had to refer how the quarter 1 and quarter 2 on additive in A and B suggested 75% versus 50% of cars getting an increase. So you had to reference those quarters specifically in your justification for additive A. If you answered additive B, it was automatically incorrect for the question. You got no credit. For the second part of part B, when they're looking for the higher mean mileage, you had to justify additive B using either the fact that the outliers brings down the mean for additive A, or that the skewness of B raises the average for additive B. So either using the outlier, basically you're justifying with shape. So the outliers on A brings the average down, or the skewness of B brings it up for B. And you had to state that specifically as your, oh, we got another person, justification. And again, if you answered incorrectly by saying additive A was your choice for the second question, then it was no points at all. Any questions on how College Board grade that question?
So